I didn't raise my voice when the HOA president wagged her finger at me and called my uncle a squatter. I didn't even flinch when she threatened to put a lien on my home if I didn't remove him immediately. Instead, I calmly slid a thin folder across the table. Inside was a signed housing order from the Department of Defense, complete with the official seal. I didn't need to explain a thing. Their lawyer picked it up, read the first line, and his face drained of color. He leaned over to whisper something to the president, and for the first time since this whole mess began, she shut her mouth. That moment wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, surgical, and final. They had no idea the rules they were so eager to enforce had already been outranked by a higher authority than they'd ever imagined. But to understand how we got there, I need to take you back. Because none of this started with me wanting a fight. It started with me wanting peace. I moved into this neighborhood because it wasn't flashy. The homes were older, mostly built in the 70s and 80s, and the lots had enough space between them that you could breathe. My property came with something that sealed the deal for me, a small guest house my grandfather built decades ago. It wasn't big, one bedroom, a little kitchen, a bathroom, and a porch where you could sit and watch the sun sink behind the trees. It had character. My grandfather built it with his own hands. And every nail seemed to carry a story. For years I kept the guest house as a kind of family retreat. Friends stayed there when they needed a break. My cousins used it during college summers, and I sometimes rented it short-term when money was tight. It was never a problem. The HOA knew it existed. It was on the official plat map filed with the county before the HOA was even formed. It wasn't a shed, it wasn't an illegal add-on. It was as much a part of my property as the main house itself. When my uncle retired from the Army after nearly 20 years of service, he didn't have a plan for what came next. He was dealing with the adjustment that so many veterans face, finding peace after years of constant structure and deployment. He didn't ask for much, just a quiet place to land where he could get his bearings. So when I told him the guest house was his for as long as he needed, he looked at me like I just handed him the keys to the world. He moved in with a few boxes, some photos from his service, and a beat-up rocking chair he set on the porch. For the first time in a long time, he had somewhere to belong. That's when the trouble began. 2 weeks after he moved in, I found a piece of paper taped to my front door. It was from the HOA, and it was worded like a sheriff's eviction notice. Unauthorized occupant in accessory dwelling, it read. According to them, my uncle was an unapproved tenant violating community housing rules. The notice demanded that I remove him immediately or face fines. At first, I laughed. It had to be a mistake. He wasn't a tenant, he was family. He wasn't running a business out of the guest house or renting it to strangers. He was simply living in a legally built structure on land I owned outright, but a week later, another notice arrived. This one was more aggressive, claiming that fines were already accruing at $100 a day until the illegal occupancy ended. They even threatened to seek legal action if I didn't comply. My uncle tried to brush it off. "Don't worry about me," he said. "I can find somewhere else." But I wasn't about to let a petty HOA bully my family out of a home that had been ours for decades. I started by trying to reason with them. I sent emails to the board, attaching copies of the county's property records showing the guest house was part of the original parcel. I highlighted the sections of their own bylaws that said nothing about relatives living in accessory dwellings. I even asked for a meeting to clear up what had to be a misunderstanding. Their response? Silence. No acknowledgement of the documents. No willingness to meet, just more notices piling up in my mailbox. Then things escalated. They sent certified mail threatening to file a lien on my property. They demanded inspection access to the guest house, which I flatly refused. I started noticing cars slowing down in the alley behind my home, taking pictures of the guest house like we were running some kind of criminal operation. Neighbors who used to wave suddenly avoided eye contact. The HOA president cornered me in the driveway one afternoon and, with all the smugness she could muster, accused me of harboring a squatter. That was the breaking point. Not because of the insult, but because of who she was talking about. My uncle, a man who had put in 2 decades of service, who had stood in places most of us would never dare to go, who had come home carrying invisible scars, wasn't a squatter, he was family. And if they thought they could push him out with paper threats and intimidation, they were about to learn how wrong they were. So I changed my approach. I stopped writing polite emails, I stopped explaining myself. Instead, I began gathering. I kept every letter and voicemail in a binder, organized by date. I pulled the original subdivision records from the county clerk's office, showing that the Guesthouse had been recorded before the HOA was even incorporated. I studied state law on accessory dwellings, housing rights, and veterans' protections. That's when I stumbled onto something that changed everything. Buried in the federal housing regulations was a protection for retired service members in transitional housing. Because of his medical classification and retirement status, my uncle was authorized under Department of Defense housing provisions to reside in family-provided accommodations without interference. In plain English, his housing was federally protected. The HOA had no authority, none, to evict him. I confirmed it through a JAG officer my uncle had served with. He sent me a memorandum with the official seal, spelling it out in terms even the most stubborn HOA couldn't ignore. My uncle hadn't known about it, and neither had I, but once I had that document in my hands, the entire game shifted. By the time the HOA scheduled their so-called compliance hearing, I was ready. I walked into that stuffy little conference room with my binder of evidence and the Department of Defense order tucked neatly inside. They expected me to beg for leniency, maybe promise to move my uncle out or negotiate down the fines. Instead, I let them talk. I listened while the president ranted about community standards and unauthorized dwellings. I didn't interrupt when she waved around a stack of violation notices like they were gospel. I just waited until she was done, then placed the Dodd memorandum on the table and slid it toward their lawyer. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd heard in months. The lawyer read the first few lines, then looked up at me with a face that said it all. They were finished. He whispered something to the president, who sputtered and tried to continue, but the damage was done. They had been outranked. Not by me, but by federal law. The aftermath was almost anticlimactic. The fines vanished. The certified letters stopped. A formal apology never came, of course, but I didn't need one. 2 board members resigned within a month, citing personal reasons. The president stayed on, but now she won't make eye contact when I wave. My uncle still lives in the guest house. He tends a small vegetable garden in the mornings, sips coffee on the porch, and for the first time since retiring, he has peace. The neighborhood feels different now, quieter, not because the HO suddenly became kind, but because they learned their limits. They'd pushed too far, and they got burned by their own arrogance. They tried to evict a veteran from his family's home, and instead, they ended up exposed as bullies who didn't even understand the law they claimed to enforce. Looking back, I realized the real victory wasn't just keeping my uncle in the guest house. It was showing them that their power wasn't absolute, that there are rules bigger than theirs, and people willing to stand up when they cross the line. My uncle calls it justice. I call it balance restored. And now when I sit on his porch, with him at sunset, watching the light fade over the trees, I can't help but think that quiet was worth every late night I spent digging through the law.